Cognition and mental abilities basically boils down to having a better understanding of how it is our brain works and how that brain works and how it then helps us to better understand life and how it is we engage the world around us with our varying senses. And you would think, as far advanced as human creatures happen to be at this present time, that we should, by all, at least what I might consider normal accounts, we should be able to manage our own control over our own thoughts. In other words, we should have a bit of control over what it is we think about. Then again, if you're someone who's overweight and you have struggled with trying to maintain a mental focus on not eating, what is one of the most significant things you find yourself thinking about? Right, you're thinking about what you're going to have to eat next. For individuals who have experienced some sort of significant trauma, trying not to think about the trauma doesn't do much for you except to increase your anxiety about the trauma that you're trying to avoid thinking about. Or there are other people who dread the difficulty of making decisions. So what do you try to do to avoid those decisions? You end up thinking about all of the things that you should decide as it relates to the particular decision you're trying to make. The list goes on and on. It boils down to the fact often that many times the things we don't want to think about, we think about the most. Now, the late Daniel Wegner of Harvard University conducted a number of pioneering works on the nature of mental control. Now, that research suggested, rather paradoxically, that it's not so much the thoughts themselves that provide the power, but more than anything else, what we end up having trouble with is the attempt to suppress the thought. The very act of thought suppression gives rise to the preoccupation of the unwanted thought. In a set of elegant experiments, Wegner and his colleagues asked research participants to verbalize their stream of consciousness to a tape recorder for a 5-minute period. Now, some of those participants were told specifically to try to think of a white bear, whereas other participants were instructed to not think about a white bear. The groups were then told to ring a bell whenever the thought of the white bear came to mind. After the 5 minutes elapsed, participants were given the opposite instructions. In other words, those whose initial request was to suppress the thought of a bear were told to think about a bear, and vice versa. And what they came to understand is that every time those particular thoughts came to mind, they were asked to ring the bell. And what happened as a part of the results regarding that experiment is that, as you well imagine, participants in the initial suppression group or the suppression period had difficulty not thinking about a white bear. However, during the expression period, these same people showed significantly more preoccupation with thoughts of a white bear than those subjects directly instructed to entertain the thought from the outset. In other words, the act of initial thought suppression produced a rebound effect, calling the unwanted thought to mind even greater in intensity and frequency. There were attempts at suppression that reduced obsession with the unwanted thought as well, but Wegner and his colleagues later investigated the phenomenon in relation to the mental control strategies of depressives, the suppression of thoughts of sex, stress, and mental control, individual differences in mental control, psychophysiological concomitants of thought suppression, and a general theory of ironic processes. Now, what all of that simply explains is that suppression and obsession go together. Wegner suggested several possibilities. First, by never allowing the thought to be entertained in consciousness, we never quite get used to the presence or what it might signify. As soon as the visions of pepperonis dance around in the head of the one who's on a diet, for example, the immediate reaction is to squash, to suppress, or to banish the thought. This is the short-term solution. However, as our suppression attempts fail to keep pace with the insistence of the thought, every other time the thought is going to creep back into consciousness, and it does so at full power, eventually resulting in our preoccupation with it. Second, and more generally, Wegner proposed that when we attempt to control our mental processes, there are two different mental cognitive processes at work. An operating process promotes the intended changes by searching for mental contents that are consistent with the desired end result. For example, the thought to not giggle in the face of a stressful, somber situation would be the desired end state of one's mental control activities. At the same time, however, the monitoring process tests whether the operating process is still needed by searching for mental contents that are inconsistent with the desired state. In this present example, the monitor would then search for giggling and then return either a negative or a positive value to the operating process. But here's the rub. Although the operating process is somewhat effortful, requiring greater cognitive capacity, the monitoring process is more automatic and takes far less effort. Now, when the two are working in harmony, the thinker can revel in some measure of mental control. But if the mental system is taxed in any way, or cognitive resources end up being depleted in some other way, it will be the more effortful operating process that gets disrupted. The monitoring process is searching for the to-be-banished thought now becomes more pronounced and serves to heighten the thinker's sensitivity as it relates to the unwanted thought. It's clear that thought suppression, the roots of obsession, and the nature of mental control are not only fascinating, they interact and they're extremely complex. A great deal has now been understood about the processes at work and the applications as they relate to therapy, other psychological interventions, the reduction of stress, pain control, and even health. All such studies are still underway. Now, as we continue to unpack cognition and other mental abilities, it is going to be very, very important for you to understand exactly how it is that cognition is defined in our context. Cognition refers to the mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience, and the senses. Now, there are three significant building blocks to thought. We have language, there are images, and the concepts that we use to make up the entire process we call cognition. Now, if we begin with language, to peel back another layer, we need to understand how language comes together. Now, language is compiled of what we call phonemes, morphemes, grammar, syntax, semantics. All of those things form a stew that we call language. Phonemes are the smallest part of letters that then go together to form morphemes. Morphemes are a series of words that we use then to construct a grammar. We use grammar then to construct what we call syntax, or the proper use of grammar, and we take syntax and we use that to understand to a great degree how it is we use semantics. All of that put together basically is what we call language. Now, Sapir and Whorf originally proposed what we call the linguistic relativity hypothesis, and it suggests that, first of all, language determines thought. Now think about that for just a minute. Language controls what it is you think about. Now, the moderated view of that theory suggests that language, thought, and culture are intertwined. And of course, like many other languages lacking a gender-neutral pronoun, English can lead people to form gendered conclusions about those being discussed or described. In other words, the use of quote-unquote man in a gender-neutral sense almost never is. We also have images. Now, mental images represent objects or events and have a picture-like quality, as you might guess. Concepts, on the other hand, are typically fuzzy. They have all kinds of boundaries of inclusion or exclusion, and all of those things are up for grabs. Prototypes provide the quote-unquote best example of a concept. Now, what all of this suggests is that we think in language. Language makes our thought. So if you have to consider which came first, the chicken or the egg, or language or thought, the answer, at least the short answer, is going to be language. Now, just to give you an idea of how I mean that, is if I ask you to think about what is it that you had for dinner last night. And some of you automatically will, quote, say to yourself, well, Dr. Hamilton, I had XYZ. My children had QRS, or whatever else it is they happen to have had. At our house last night, we ate leftovers, as an example. What I'm getting at is that you are hearing that sort of, quote, thought in your mind's ear. In other words, you're saying it to yourself. Well, I had steak for supper last night, or I had bacon and eggs for breakfast this morning, or I did this or that at lunchtime today, or whatever else. You're thinking using your native language usually. Now, are you going to find individuals who predominantly speak English who think in Spanish? Of course, but there will probably be a reason for that. I have a family member who works for the federal government. His secondary language, first off, his primary language is English. He is a Caucasian, middle-aged male, which already means that he's part of the oncoming minority. But his second significant language is Spanish. So, for him to maintain his ability to speak and to manage well using Spanish, he reads Spanish. So he reads novels, just like you and I would go read an English novel. He reads those same novels in Spanish, or he listens to Spanish podcasts, or whatever else, so that those particular elements of Spanish language are always present in his mind's eye. And it helps him to keep different parts of different languages separate, because when they get mixed up and conjoined, it can become rather confusing. So just bear in mind that language boils down to the understanding of thoughts, how it is we use those thoughts. Language begins with phonemes and moves to morphemes. Morphemes move to grammar. Grammar moves to syntax, and then syntax moves to what we call semantics. All of those things together form what we call language. Now, please remember that even though you and I speak in what you and I understand to be English, there are other ways to communicate. For example, there is non-human language as well as thought. Let's say, for example, the animal kingdom. How is it that your dog understands what he or she is supposed to do when you tell your dog to sit? They come to understand, at the very least, because of the inflection of your voice term or your voice tone, what you want the dog to do. Our older black Labrador Retriever, more often than not, if you tell him to sit, he will lay down. If you tell him to lay down, he will lay down. Part of that is related to his fact that he's lazy, and part of it boils down to the fact that we'll let him use those both interchangeably. But animals, not just dogs, but other animals in general, communicate with signs, which are also global statements about a current state of their own capacity. Research with Coco, which was a chimpanzee, and other primates has suggested that animals can communicate intention as well as future desired states. Now, there is some significant controversy that exists over the lack of evidence that animals can grasp the deep structures related to language. However, animals nonetheless manage to communicate not only with one another, but also with humans. Parrots, dolphins, chimps, and other species demonstrate human-like cognitive capacity. Now, if you really want to get your ire turned up just a little bit, go and watch a couple of the relatively new Planet of the Apes movies. In those movies, the gorillas, chimps, and other primates of lower form have developed the capacity to speak. Now, interestingly enough, what language do they speak? They speak English, because that's what the movie is in. The movie is in English, so they speak English. Now, they become self-aware in these particular movies, and becoming self-aware then is one of the beginning places to being able to formulate a thought which then helps you come up with the continuing aspects of language. Again, chimps, bonobos, orangutans, dolphins, elephants, magpies, gorillas all show some sort of success in what's called the mirror test. The mirror test is when you have these animals look into the mirror and they see a reflection of themselves. And what they begin to understand over time is that they are looking at themselves, not something or someone else. Many years ago, we had a puppy at our house. And the first time the puppy saw an image of himself in the mirror, he tried to eat the mirror because he didn't know that it was a picture of himself. It took him a while to understand that what he was seeing in the mirror was himself and not another dog. As crazy as that might sound, that's how some animals manage to communicate. When it comes to solving problems, not only animals or lower animals, but human creatures as well, go about it in varying ways. When it comes to solving a problem, it's going to be important that we understand what it is we're trying to do. In other words, problem representation is a crucial first step toward problem solving. If you don't know what the problem represents, it's going to be difficult to solve. Divergent thinking can often foster a creative solution, while convergent thinking can narrow one's focus only onto a particular direction. In other words, when we're trying to work with particular problems, again, it will be important that we understand what we're trying to do. What is it we're trying to solve? What sort of task are we trying to complete? Are we willing to think in a diverse way? Are we willing to look at other outside the norm possibilities, which is divert thinking or divergent thinking? Or are we stuck? Can we only think of solving a particular challenge in the way that we've solved any other sort of challenge? That's more convergent-like, and it tends to limit one's focus. Now, with the implementation of certain strategies and other evaluating progress and processes, we can approach problem solving with a handful of different possibilities. We use what we would call trial and error as a process. Now, trial and error, when it comes to solving a problem, this really isn't terribly efficient. We can also use what's called information retrieval, which is when we are in doubt, we're going to memorize something. We can use algorithms. Algorithms are a process of solving problems that will guarantee you a solution if all of the steps are followed in the correct sequence and according to how those sequences should be taken care of. Heuristics basically are defined as a rule of thumb that tend toward a specific type of conclusion, which often includes a means to an end analysis, which that means that sub-goals become very important. Or we work from a backward perspective, reverse engineering, as it were. You know, the rumor has it, as an example, that a lot of what we understand in the potential for space flight in our contemporary culture comes from information that we have learned because we have captured and have located somewhere in the United States, for many people is Area 51, where we have access to other alien-like technology, and we have quote-unquote reverse engineered the ability to fly further into space. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I'm for or against such ideas. What I am going to tell you is that some people think in those terms, and solving problems using a heuristic simply means that they are working backward. They're starting from the end result. In other words, if we as Americans happen to have some sort of alien technology in some hangar someplace in New Mexico called Area 51, that helps us understand how the aliens are flying through space, we'll take that technology and apply it to our own contexts and then create ways for our own selves to be able to fly or to move through space in a more appropriate way, or at least a more efficient way. Now, there are always going to be obstacles when it comes to solving problems. One of those difficulties will be what we call a mental set. In other words, are you trying to work out a problem using a limited amount of resources? Or we could also use or run into difficulty if we use what's called functional fixedness, meaning that we are only able to solve problems in one or two or three ways versus a much more divergent perspective related to solving problems. Do we get fixed on what has worked for us related to this type of problem, and do we apply the same principles to another sort of problem, assuming that we're going to receive a similar result? All of those processes are possible. But when it comes to decision making specifically, we have to know, first of all, what type of problem solving tool we're going to use. And we're also going to have to deal with the varying number of possible solutions or choices that we already know. For example, how is it you're going to change a tire? Seems like a rather obvious sort of challenge, unless you happen to be 15 or 16 and have never been required to change a tire before. Then how it is you go about solving that particular problem or making decisions related to the change of that flat tire might put you in a situation where you're a bit overwhelmed. Now, I am far, far older than most, if not all of you. I've changed more than one tire in my life. I know of a number of different ways to change a tire, but at the end of the day, in the very shortest language I know, you have to figure out how to undo some nuts so that you can get the tire off the vehicle. Now, you either have to have the equipment in your own shop, or you have to take the tire and the wheel to a place that has the equipment to change that flat and let those people take the tire off the rim after they found the mar or the difficulty with the tire, patch it, fix it, weld it, mold it, whatever it is they do, vulcanize it, whatever it is they do to fix that particular challenge with the tire. Put the tire back on the wheel, give the wheel back to you. Then you take the wheel and you take those same nuts you took off, you put your wheel back on the studs and you bolt down those particular nuts and you set your car back down on the ground and you go on about your way. At the end of the day, there's only a limited amount of ways that you can change that tire. But those particular ways involve the taking off of some nuts, repair to the tire itself, and remounting of that tire. That's about it. I cannot change a tire by getting my vacuum cleaner from the other end of my house and approaching my tire with that vacuum cleaner. Not going to help me. It might get some of the dirt off of the tire, but is it going to help me change a flat tire? Not so much. It's a wasted tool in that regard. So using that as an example, not using my vacuum cleaner is part of my decision-making process as it relates to changing a flat tire. Again, may sound kind of foolish, but please understand that the way you frame a decision is going to influence the decision that gets made. Best example I know, my oldest child had never been compelled to change a tire. She left high school when she was a senior, was going to drive about the 6 blocks to get home, and she realized that she had a low tire, but she managed to get home before the tire went flat. Now, being the good dad that I am, I instructed her from afar how to change her tire. I took it as a teaching moment. I told her she had to get some of the tools out of the various places in her car so she could use them. She had to get the nuts off of the bolts. After she did that, she had to get the tire off of the car, take the tire to a repair shop to get it worked on, and bring it back and put it back on. Well, interestingly enough, when she took the tire off, she took it to be repaired. And part of the process of repairing a flat tire is that you will take the valve stem out of the valve on that tire. Well, when they undid the cap to the valve, someone had taken a little bitty rock and set it on top of the valve stem and put the screw tab back down on it, which allowed the air to get out. In other words, there wasn't anything wrong with her tire. So when the person who was working on it figured out that somebody had let the air out of the tire as a joke, that person just put air back in the tire and sent her home. So what she discovered is that again, we're using general psychology language for it 20 years after the fact, or however long ago, because the decision that she had to make related to that tire involved getting it off of the car and getting it repaired. Well, that's one particular mindset. The problem was framed in that way. Flat tire means whole. Whole needs repair before you can put it back on. Now, when that frame changed, in other words, when she realized that the tire, there was no damage to the tire, it was simply had been, the air had simply been let out of it, the frame for making those decisions changed. And as a result of the changed frame, she made a different decision. Now, we can also use what's called a compensatory decision-making process. We can evaluate all of the choices based on specific criteria, as an example. We can use decision-making heuristics as another way to solve some sort of great problem, which includes availability as well as a confirmation bias. A confirmation bias is simply, in the very plainest language I know, when researchers look for something, they find it. They will always find what it is they look for, and they must guard against the confirmation bias. So they have to make sure they do not mistakenly fall into their own self-made trap related to their own confirmation. We can always find what we're looking for. We also will have episodes when it becomes important for us to explain how it is we make decisions. Now, I'm sure you've heard the common statement, hindsight is 20/20. You bet. We always can see where we made a mistake or the possibility of where a mistake was made. When we're looking backward, we can better understand mistakes. We tend to think we knew of the outcome that was going to come about all along, but hindsight bias helps us better understand that we don't always get it done that way. Counterfactual thinking is the process by which we often wonder how things would have been if they only hadn't been the way they actually were, which again sounds kind of confusing. Just take a look carefully as the language expresses itself in the chapter, and it will make a little more sense. If you have some significant question or difficulty related to that, shoot me an email and we'll unpack it as best we can in whatever way we need to help you better understand. Now let's look for the next few minutes anyway at ideas related to intelligence, overall intelligence, as well as mental abilities. Now there are a number of theories related to intelligence. Spearman, for example, proposed what's called general intelligence. Thurston proposed 7 distinct abilities that he defined together to mean intelligence. Sternberg proposed 3 types of intelligence. Gardner proposed 9 different types of intelligence, while Goldman proposed 5 traits related to emotional intelligence. Now, so what? What does all of that mean? What it means is something rather simple. Don't make it more than what it is. Each of these 5 different researchers, all of whom happen to be psychologists, by the way, proposed ways of understanding intelligence, and they're all different. The best differentiating example is going to be Sternberg. Sternberg was of the opinion, and I'm assuming still is, that there were different types of intelligence. For example, the word I'm going to use is practical. I'm not sure that he would have used the word practical, but it boils down to everyday, normal, common sense sort of intelligence. A good example would be there are some people on the planet, and he studied various ethnic populations across the globe. They have certain tasks or jobs to take care of, things to get done during the day, or whatever you want to call those, that require a specific type of intelligence, and it was this practical type of intelligence. One of the examples related to it would be something like fire. There are places in the world where people still cook using fire. They do that outside. Now, you and I, in the wonderful state of Texas in 2021, in the early fall of 2021, typically don't use outside fire to cook with. We cook it inside using either some kind of gas or propane or electricity in an oven or on a stove, for example. But there are ethnic representations in other places on the globe that require people to use fire to cook. If you've never started a fire before and you had to use fire to cook, you would be at a loss. That practical application, or the ability to manage and maintain fire, is crucial to some people. Not so much for you, not so much for me. It's one thing to be necessary to use fire to survive. It's something else to choose to use fire. In these cases, it's a necessity for some places and for some people on the planet. For those like you and me, not so much. That practical type of intelligence was important. And again, there you can look in your textbook, and each one of these folks is represented, and they will unpack to a greater or lesser degree which types of intelligence that each one of those persons aspires to. Now, and I would be curious to know where it is you come out on some of these things. Some of this stuff will not make any sense to you, and other parts of these theories will make perfectly good sense to you. I'd be curious to know how it is you get to your thought process through that. Now, if you want to assess or to test intelligence, which is one of the things that I do as part of a clinical psychologist, you can use different sorts of psychological assessment tools to measure certain types of intelligence. One of the standards is what's called the Stanford Binay intelligence tests. That is one of the very few assessments I'm not trained on. I don't know, I haven't ever used that one. Instead, I use Webster intelligence scales. But with the Stanford Binay, the IQ score was determined, or is determined, by dividing the mental age of the person by the chronological age and multiplying the quotient by 100, yada, yada, yada. It's a statistical thing that they use. It's a mathematical equation that they use to get a number that becomes a representation of a person's intelligence. Now, with the Webster scales, we use Webster tools to establish number representatives of certain types of intelligence based on 4 different indexes. In other words, we look at both verbal and nonverbal subtests and put those categories together to then get to another number that is a numerical representation of an intelligence score. Group tests like these can be used to eliminate all kinds of biases, but they also may mask information about how the individual takes a test. For example, performance and culture fair tests are the types of instruments that seek to eliminate or to minimize verbal dependence. Biological measures of intelligence lack the predictive ability of traditional approaches. And what I'm getting at here is that we can use any number of different tools to measure assessment, or to measure intelligence using assessment tools. Now, what you need to understand, just to give you a little more background information related to intelligence scoring and testing, the average IQ across all psychological domains is 100. In other words, if we had 10 people in the classroom and I did psychological tests on all 10 of you, the average IQ score would be 100 plus or minus 10. Now that's called a standardized score. Again, it's a mathematical equation that helps us understand the average. The average IQ, 100. Now, the next step going up is going to be 111 or 110 to 119. that is going to be quote unquote above average. Going the other way, going from 99 down to 90 is going to be, you guessed it, below average. Now, statistically speaking, 95% of all IQ scores will fall. That's not correct. 64%, my mistake. 64%, which is the top part of a bell curve, right? The top part of a bell curve, 32.5 points on either side of the midline, will gather up 95% of the people you are testing. In other words, the majority will test in the center, in the middle of that range. There'll be outliers on either side. The further out you go, the numbers get much more small. Again, the average IQ is 100. You'll find that there are some individuals you will come into contact with who may score in the 130s. That's a pretty sharp person. But please don't misunderstand one's IQ score. An IQ score simply is a numerical representation of what a person does with information when it enters the brain. Information gets into your brain through one of 5 senses, right? Now, what your brain does with that information once it gets in there, that's the intelligence quotient. Doesn't mean you're smarter than the average Joe. It just means that you have a different type of cognitive capacity than the other person. Good, bad, or indifferent. I haven't had an IQ test in however many bunches and bunches of years. I couldn't tell you what my IQ was if I needed to do that. I couldn't take any of the tests that I administer because I already know the answers. I would have to take some instrument like the Stanford Binay, and some other psychologist would have to administer it to me for me to get a correct score. Now, some of you may have children who are in the public school system who want to be moved into or already are into gifted and talented programs. Each individual school district often has a baseline IQ score that's necessary for children to be considered for their gifted and talented programs. When my oldest child tested for those programs back when she was in the 2nd or 3rd grade, when she did her IQ test, a test done for her at the school, her IQ score was 132. Again, average is 100, but 132 suggests she's pretty sharp. Okay, to get into the gifted and talented program in that school district, she needed 135. So even as sharp as she was with an IQ at that point in time of 132, it didn't meet the minimum necessary to get into that gifted and talented program. She never was a member of any gifted and talented program. Very bright young lady all through her scholastic career, but she never was quite high enough to get to what she thought she needed to go do. Please also remember that the more you age, the more often you test IQs and other things like IQs or intelligence quotients. The longer you do that, the lower they're going to go. And what I mean is, if I tested my IQ today and it was 150, chances are when I tested it again a year or 2 from now, it would be less than 150. It's possible that it would be significantly less than 150. The time after that, if I was to test again another year or 2 later, it would come down another number of points, however many. Not because I'm aging, but because statistically, in other words, from a mathematical perspective, IQ scores always move to the average. The average is at 100, so regardless of how big it happens to be on either side, however great an IQ score or however not great an IQ score, the longer you test that same person, the closer those scores are going to get to average. If you haven't noticed by now, Psychological assessment is a fascinating thing for me. I love it. I love to do it. I love to administer tools and give other people very clear understandings of the individuals that I'm testing. I can speak long and often fairly intelligently about IQ scores, as well as other types of intelligence testing, emotional testing, and emotional intelligence, all those other sorts of things related to the idea of psychological assessment. But I don't want us to get hung up there at the moment, so we'll let that go for now. Let's talk for just a minute about heredity, about the environment, and how those things relate to intelligence. Surprisingly enough, there is an element of intelligence that is in the gene pool. In other words, you have inherited certain elements of your intelligence from those who created you. Twin studies help us understand that. Other genetic studies and adoption studies help us better understand how heredity contributes to one's intelligence level. There is also an environmental component related to intelligence. Great example for individuals of what the only way I know the only words I know at the moment to describe it would be to say those who have a lower socioeconomic status than I have in the community. Individuals who don't have as great an access to certain tools or certain activities or whatnot. Individuals who would start life behind the curve, as it were. Some of those individuals, their environment is going to be a hindrance to their progression related to their intelligence. In other words, sometimes you can't account and you can't overrule the environment in which a person was raised. Often those sorts of factors influence one's intelligence to the point that it cannot be altered. Genes will express themselves in particular environments. Nutrition, if a person doesn't have access to adequate nutrition as a youngster, that will contribute to one's lower IQ score. Overall cognitive stimulation, access to education, certain types of play, all of those factors will influence the expression of intelligence. Now there is an ongoing debate related to IQ. We call it a within group versus a between group difference. And what that means is that it's really difficult to tease apart some of the challenges related to IQ testing over time, and we'll just leave it at that. Different genders in different cultures will test differently. There are cognitive differences between men and women. However, those differences appear to be restricted to only a certain number of cognitive skills. There are gender differences all the time, but when they are present, they are usually rather small. Now, I need you to understand something very, very important here. I said gender differences. I am not speaking about male and female when I refer to gender. Sexuality is male or female. Gender is a social construct. In other words, gender is what the culture tells us it means to be a man or a woman. For example, I saw a thing on LinkedIn this morning. I happened to be out on LinkedIn for what I don't remember. But there was a gentleman, probably 6'2", fairly thin, wore earrings, dangly kind, very feminine earrings, had a full beard, very dark black hair, black beard, wearing a rather attractive dress. Now, again, I'm not speaking for or against his choice of clothing, but he was making a statement related to gender because he was referencing the LGBTIQ community. As a part of his post, is the only reason I knew that. He's very open, very out loud and proud, but he was making some comments related to the expression of his gender. okay, which is the appropriate way to say it. You can put a dress on a man, but that won't make him a woman. I don't mean that to sound rude, but that's what it boils down to. He could have worn a bra, um, an exceptional bra if he wanted. He could have put padded material in the bra if he wanted to wear underneath his dress and his 4-inch pumps that he was wearing at the time. However, it will make no difference how that person dresses. He will always be a he, unless some sort of surgical procedure changes that. So when I speak about gender differences related to intelligence, we're talking about things other than male or female. Now, there are some intelligence differences that can be documented to be a product of biology that is about male and female. Again, don't get cultural constructs confused with biological constructs. All of those things will influence one's level of intelligence. Part of those are biological, others of them not. When we're comparing cultures, we have come to understand that different cultures will test differently when it comes to certain types of intelligence. When it comes to extreme levels of intelligence, you'll find on a scale anyway, that any person who scores on an IQ scale of 70 or below is normally going to have some sort of what we call adaptive behavioral concern that also contributes to their lack of cognitive function. When an IQ drops below 60, the person who's testing in that regard will have other sorts of challenges, like they may not be able to take care of themselves very well, regardless of their age. They might be prone to make very poor choices when given opportunity to choose because of their cognitive function, that sort of idea. Now, when it comes to different causes of what we would call sexual disabilities, there are a number of challenges that relate to cognitive environment, as well as circumstances when people have been deprived of something that's important as it relates to the development of intelligence. Could be chromosomal or other genetic concerns, could be dietary restrictions or dietary deficiencies that have inhibited the development of intelligence in some way or other. Lastly, in Chapter 7, I'm going to speak briefly, and when I say briefly, I mean very briefly, to certain ideas related to creativity. Creativity and intelligence may bear some relation to one another, but there are some distinctions between both of those constructs. Creativity involves individuals who are problem finders as well as problem solvers. Creative people are often also very high in their extroversion, which is a comparison toward introversion. Extroverted people are those folks who tend to be a little more energized or more energized with the presence of others. Introverts, on the other hand, are those individuals who are more energized by being more alone. But creativity, when it relates to high extroversion, can also be misperceived as individuals having greater intelligence, when that may not be the case. There are bukus of creativity tests that are available in the marketplace, and some of those have a higher or lesser ability to predict creative behavior. In other words, just because some number on a test, a testing score, suggests that a person can do XYZ or not do XYZ, doesn't mean that's real. It may suggest that possibility, but one of the exceptions to all of those rules is going to be the individual who simply doesn't test well. All of us know either ourselves who don't test very well because of our own anxiety or whatever else, or certainly we know of individuals who don't test well because of test anxiety or general lack of preparation or whatever. But creativity, when it comes to at least this chapter as it relates to cognition and mental ability, is that creativity is somehow, often not very well understood, but it is somehow related to intelligence. And that by the by, you will find individuals who are problem solving people, and you'll find individuals who are problem finding people. Often those folks are the same people, but often it's just as likely that they may not be. Keep those things in mind as you navigate through notions related to cognition and mental ability. Again, if I can help you with any of the more challenging aspects related to intelligence, certainly intelligence testing, don't hesitate to let me know. I'll be happy to help or to answer whatever questions I can. If I can't, or if I don't know an answer, I'm certainly willing to go find an answer for you. But if anything else comes up, certainly drop me an email. I'll look forward to seeing you or hearing from you soon.